Hey, Changemaker! Welcome to Learning for Good, the only podcast that teaches nonprofit leaders how to leverage training to drive performance, improve capacity, and fuel their mission impact. Do you ever feel like your nonprofit is growing, but your people just aren't keeping up? Or like you're fixing the same problems over and over? Do you wonder how to build confident, capable staff who know how to lead, not just execute? If we haven't met yet, I'm Heather, and I know how hard it can feel to get people to do what's expected of them. Trust me, I have 3 kids. I've tried telling people what to do and how. I've tried the traditional training approaches, and I realized that just doesn't work. And that's when I started researching what does work. Now, I help mission-driven leaders use learning to drive performance, build capacity, and make change that lasts. And I'm sharing it all on this podcast. So block your calendar, turn off your Teams or Slack chat, and let's dive in. It's Learning for Good. I always order workbooks for my kids to do over the summer break. They aren't required to get through the whole thing, but it gives them something to work on over the summer. And one morning this past summer, I told my oldest daughter to do a few pages in her workbook. And she responded with frustration. I have actual schoolwork to do. Her school had sent her home with a packet of work over the summer. I didn't say anything. I just let her feel that frustration. And then she asked, "Did you have homework in the summer when you were a kid?" And I'm like, absolutely not. That was not a thing when I was a kid. And that's when the dreaded words appeared. "You just don't get it, Mom." For that moment, she felt like I didn't understand her feelings, her situation. And she's right in that I never experienced summer homework at her age. But I can empathize with her. I can imagine what that would feel like when school is out for summer and you just want to sleep in or do crafts or hang out with your friends, read something you actually want to read, right? Just for fun. But feeling like you always have that packet of homework hanging over your head. And now your mom is asking you to do a workbook too. And so as I responded with empathy, not just do it or get over it. We created a solution that would work for both of us. Empathy is a key skill in parenting, and it's a key skill in the workplace. And I think it might be one of the most essential skills for learning designers. So where can we learn empathy? There's no better place than from design thinking. And that's why I've invited Sheryl Cababa to join me on the podcast today. We're going to talk all about design thinking and systems thinking. Let's dive in. It's Learning for Good. Sheryl Cababa is the author of Closing the Loop: Systems Thinking for Designers. She's a design researcher and strategist and is the Chief Strategy Officer at Optimistic Design, an education-focused research and insight studio based in Seattle. Her practice is focused on systems thinking and equity-centered design, and she's worked with a diverse base of clients, including the Gates Foundation, Microsoft, IKEA, and Khan Academy. Her focus is on using design to help clients reimagine education. She also teaches at the University of Washington's Human-Centered Design and Engineering program, helping to introduce systems thinking to the next generation of designers. Sheryl, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I can't wait for this conversation. We haven't done a lot around design thinking or systems thinking on the podcast yet, so I'm excited to learn from you and to be able to share all of your expertise with the Learning for Good listeners as well. One of the things I always like to start with, though, is I like to understand your career journey, because I always find it so fascinating. How did you get where you are? Why systems thinking? Why design thinking? Why the equity-centered background? What is it that got you here today? Can you connect those dots for us?
Yeah, for sure. So my background is it's been a twisty journey to where I've come today. And I started out in school. I my degrees are actually in journalism and in political science. But somehow, because I was coming out of school in the late 90s, I ended up in the tech industry. So I ended up working for Microsoft for quite a while as a product designer and then ended up continuing to be a digital product designer for several years. I worked for Philips and Getty Images, amongst other organizations. And then I went into design consulting and became a design researcher and design strategist. And that's what I am today. And I've been doing that now for about 15 years. I think part of why I ended up where I am, and it ties back to my degrees of journalism, which has the storytelling piece, and political science, which has like the societal trends piece, is that design research is really about understanding people and their relationship with products and services. And how do we better design things so that they resonate with people as well as serve their needs? And so, as a design researcher, I oftentimes go out and try to understand people's context. So, do a lot of work in education, for example, and my team spends time with students, with teachers in classrooms, and really understanding the context in which maybe a new product or service might be integrated. And so that could mean digital education products. If you think about products like Khan Academy and how those might be used in the classroom and beyond, if you think about courseware and how it might be used in the post-secondary system in universities, et cetera, those are the kinds of things that we're focused on. And how do you better integrate these products to help not just the products themselves be used successfully, but also helping people who are the end users of these things be successful or fulfill their needs. And so that's where I am today. And I think part of my journey has been understanding that when we talk about people who use products and services, we're not just talking about the average user either. We oftentimes need to consider a really diverse set of individuals, of groups, of communities that might be users of products and services, but also who might be affected by things that are put out in the world. If you think about, for example, digital products and how they've affected everyone, if we think about social media platforms, for example, you might not even be a user of a social media platform, but the way it's used ends up affecting all of us. Think about AI and how AI has been implemented really broadly across systems. It affects all of us, whether we're end users of that or not. And so thinking about that from a design strategy, from a design thinking, and from a systems thinking lens is a really core part of my job.
So I talk a lot about my audience mainly is people who are designing training or other learning solutions. And I talk a lot about context and how often we create training without all the context that we need to really move the needle or change behavior from whatever we're creating. And so we spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about context and understanding the audience's needs and things like that. So you've used the term design thinking a few times, and I want us to start there. What is design thinking and how is it used?
So, design thinking, I oftentimes describe it as well as human centered design. In some ways, they're interchangeable, but human centered design is really considering, yeah, centering those who are end users, who are going to be the recipients of the things that we're designing, understanding and empathizing with their situation and with their context and their pain points as well and their needs, and then strategizing to design around that. And a key part of design thinking is actually the iterative way that we engage in design. And so it could be that, let's say, if you're designing trainings, you first try to understand foundationally your end users and what they need and what are the things that resonate with them and what are the things that we need to understand in order to create the behavior change, for example, that you're trying to create. And then you take those learnings and you consider, okay, how do we now design a thing that will resonate with folks? Folks don't like webinars. I don't know. They want more activity based experiences, or they learn better that way, for example. And you take these and you create themes, and then you iteratively design for that. So you might prototype something, and then you go back to those end users and you test with them. And then you like incrementally tweak the solution. And then you do this repeatedly until you have something that works really well and really resonates. And one thing that I like, and this is oftentimes described as a 5-part process, which is empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. Prototype and test can be like the same because they're related. But the idea is that before you invest really heavily in releasing something, you do these things iteratively and lightweight. So when we talk about prototypes, it might just be paper prototypes, or it might be just like walking people through a system, or it might be a digital prototype that's very lightweight. You didn't have, you didn't have to actually invest in engineering for it yet. And you get your answers then before you invest in like building something. And then once you've built something, you continue to engage in this process iteratively so that you can make improvements to it as you go and as it's released. And so I view it as a way of thinking that is actually, it increases efficiencies in that we don't waste time and energy building something that people don't like or won't use. We always understand the use cases and the pain points that we're trying to address. And it crystallizes the goals more readily. And not only that, but it helps you understand who is going to be using the things that we're putting out into the world, and you're better designing for them from the jump. So that's the whole idea of design thinking, or human-centered design, in a nutshell.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And thinking as learning designers, we're often trying to work with a lot of different audiences and understand the needs of a lot of different audiences. So that might mean understanding the needs of the organization, the business goals, the strategies, that what's driving things from that perspective, the goals of our stakeholders or subject matter experts, and then this intended audience, this group that we're designing for. So keeping all that in mind, do you feel like design thinking would be helpful for us in learning and development?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and just thinking about the different ways that people learn and really understanding that. And for example, do you need to present flexible ways of learning for people's different circumstances, or can you do that? I think we do a lot of work in digital systems, and it actually affords a lot of flexibility when it comes to people's different ways of using things. So, for example, when we're designing courseware for college students to use, oftentimes some people learn better asynchronously, some people learn better in groups. And those sort of digital systems give us the flexibility to be able to account for people's different ways of learning or what resonates most with them in terms of learning. So if people, they learn better by video, for example, that can be an option. It can be an option to do more activity-based learning, and these things facilitate those differences. And I think, yeah, for learning designers, you're designing learning experiences or trainings or what have you, thinking about things in this way might make it easier to result in the outcomes that you want to see. And so having a really good understanding of what resonates with most of your users, and if you have edge cases, what are the issues that you need to address in order to be able to make everybody successful. I think thinking about things in that way could be really helpful. And I think what's a big takeaway from just engaging in human-centered design for all these years is that I oftentimes describe it as evidence-based, is because it's essentially qualitative research, and it prevents you and your stakeholders from just making decisions based on their own assumptions, right? You're actually gathering data from people who are going to be using the systems which you're designing. And so I find that it's really helpful in maybe also like resolving disagreements that you might have about what needs to be designed or what needs to be created, where you might have an executive who's like, well, this is the way I learn. So this needs to happen this way. And you're like, well, no, most of the organization, they don't want just like a lecture on X, Y, or Z. They actually want to do a workshop where they're learning this or that. And then so you prototype it and then you test it, you collect data, and maybe you even do A/B testing. Like you prototype a couple of experiences and then you gather data that way. So I also view it as just evidence-based because you are actually engaging with the actual people who are going to be the recipients of the thing you're designing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You can really get in and see, you can find out from them how they're going to be using things, but you can also see how they're going to be using things. Because sometimes even what we think we do and what we do are different. And so
Yeah,
the design thinking principles, to be able to empathize with them, to understand that context, you can start to see this is what they think they want, which might help us in marketing or certain decisions. This is how they actually are using something, how they actually are, they have a problem. This is how they're getting the answer, that kind of thing. So we can start to combine all of that and create the best solution for that. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think everyone was probably nodding their heads, listening, thinking about disagreements. And I know we can use this to resolve disagreements because there's almost always a disagreement at some point in a learning project. So I love that you're pointing this out as really as evidence. We're not operating based on assumptions. We're going in, we're understanding the audience, we're understanding their context, and we're able to make decisions based on that information.
Do you wish you could connect with other nonprofit learning and development leaders? I know what it feels like to want someone to bounce ideas off of and to learn from, someone who really understands you and your work. Imagine if you could have a simple way to meet people in the field, ask questions, and share information. That's why I created the Nonprofit Learning and Development Collective, where nonprofit L&D, talent management, and DEI leaders can connect with each other quickly and easily in a virtual space. When you join this community, you will walk away with a new, diverse, and powerful network and a sounding board for your staff development needs. So if you're ready to exchange ideas and collaborate with your peers, come join the Nonprofit L&D Collective.
So as you think about design thinking, systems thinking, and all of your work in this area, what are maybe 2 to 3 principles that we could apply in our work in learning and development? Are there things that stand out to you?
Yeah, I think one for sure is just reiterate some of what I've been mentioning, which is always centering the end user in your work. So I know one aspect of systems thinking especially is thinking about people's incentives and what are everyone's incentives who are involved, whether it's like your end users or you or your other stakeholders or your boss, and trying to understand like what drives them and why are we making decisions in this way. So I doing a lot of work in education. Sometimes I think about the whole system of, let's say we're trying to design like a learning management system or something. And you have to work with school districts, for example, and even policymakers. And then there's teachers, and then there's students, and then there's even parents, right? And all of these people have really varying incentives. So if you think about the IT person in a school district, they're like, what's the cheapest thing and what can integrate best with whatever we already have? And then you have teachers and they're like, well, what would work best in my classroom, my students, and also minimize the time I need to spend learning a new thing and trying to integrate it. And having a good understanding of these different types of incentives also helps you design something in a way that maybe doesn't fulfill everybody's incentives, but it allows you to be explicit about the decisions you are making and why. And oftentimes, the people who are in charge of funding a thing, they have certain ideas about what they want to be successful, whether it's to make a profit or what have you. And so they sometimes act against their own self-interest in that they're like, well, if it's profitable to be like, to appeal to the buyer, who's the IT manager or whatever of a big school district, then that's what we need to do. But you could design something horrid for teachers or what have you. And if the end users aren't using something, eventually that's going to fail. And so it's really like thinking about the tensions there. And so that's one thing is think about everyone's incentives who are involved. Like you're centering end users because if people don't use things, then that's the clearest sign towards something being a failure, if it's a product or service or training or learning or experience or what have you. But then you also have to think about the incentives or that other people might have. I also think a lot about think about your most extreme users. Extreme is a weird term for it, but are there folks with disabilities? Are there folks from marginalized groups who are going to be experiencing what you're designing? And how might they be affected? Because there's a tenet around this idea of inclusive design, which I think like the hypothesis is that if you design for the most extreme user, you're going to solve for others. And this is oftentimes called the curb cut effect. So in the 1970s, there are activists who basically poured concrete to create curb cuts so that they could roll wheelchairs up and down sidewalks onto streets. And it's funny because you not only do people in wheelchairs benefit from that, but if you're pushing anything on wheels, like if you're pushing a stroller or you have a cart or even you're walking alongside a bike or on a skateboard, whatever, you benefit from curb cuts as well. So other people benefit from designing for the most marginalized. And you see this as well in digital systems. I often use subtitling as a good example of that, where that is designed for those who are hearing impaired. But I'm like, I don't know about you, but I watch movies with subtitles all the time at home because there's a lot of noise in my house. We got like dogs barking, we got kids. And so a lot of other people benefit from that. Your language learning, for example. And so thinking about things in that way is also really helpful because then you don't spend time and energy designing the wrong thing for a lot of people because you're designing for the most average user. So in education, we oftentimes think about what are students experiencing? Those students who are experiencing poverty, for example, in a lot of rural school systems, there isn't good internet access. And so how do you design digital experiences for schools that will account for this, where they have crappy Wi-Fi and what have you, and maybe a lot of students don't have internet at home or they're using phones. We've done a lot of design research where we find there's actually like a lot of college students in this country who are using their phone to do their work. And so how do you design courseware experiences that account for that? So just thinking about those kind of at the margins. So I know you asked for like 2 or 3. So one is design for those at the margins. You'll benefit other people. I think the other is think about everyone, all the stakeholders involved in their incentives. And then lastly, I think really center the end users of anything that any experiences that you're designing. And you're more likely to get it right than wrong if you do that.
I'm so excited that we have had this conversation because I just know so many people are just like, hopefully they're taking notes, right? Because this is such a good episode, just thinking about how do we really understand and empathize with all the different people that we are impacting when we're creating any kind of learning solution. And to your point, it's the people around us, the stakeholders, it's the end user, and also thinking about that in a way that whatever gets created, people have to be able to access it in a way that works for them. And so really thinking about how are we doing this in an inclusive way? I just think so many people are probably nodding, snapping their fingers, whatever they do to show agreement right now, because this is just such important stuff. That said, not everyone has a design thinking background. They don't have your expertise. So if they're just getting started and you have piqued their interest and they're like, oh my gosh, I have to go figure all this out because it's exactly what I need, where should they start? Are there any books or resources or other things that you'd recommend?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about like books or resources that about design thing. I think it's just so inherent for me that I have a hard time thinking about what are the resources for people. I think I will point to my book, which is called Closing the Loop Systems Thinking for Designers, because I do give like a background of the relationship between design thinking and systems thinking. And it gives you a somewhat holistic view of what does it mean to integrate these things into not just like designing experiences, but also thinking about organizational change, for example. And I think IDEO.org has a really good resource called I think it's like the design toolkit. I'd have to look it up. But basically, if you look at like IDEO.org design toolkit, there's a lot of different methods that you can employ to collecting the data that I was mentioning before, where you're like working with end users or trying to understand their context goes beyond just like interviewing people. And I do think like one of the pitfalls of engaging in design research is oftentimes people think it's just asking people what they want. And that oftentimes doesn't work that well because people, like you mentioned earlier, people oftentimes say they want something, but it actually doesn't map to their behavior once they're in the experience of using something. There's a really good design research book called Just Enough Research by Erica Hall. I super, super highly recommend that, especially if you're thinking about engaging in the types of like contextual understanding that I mentioned earlier, or testing kind of experiences. She really breaks down what does it mean to do research around design and user experience. So I think that's a super relevant book. Probably my best recommendation, frankly, and like the themes that I've been thinking about. Yeah. And I think it's one of the things I always encourage is work with designers, like work with a designer who can help you and design researchers who can kind of help you understand this space better and who can bring that expertise into your space. And a lot of them around, they're really good at what they do. And a lot of them actually do focus on things like organizational change and learning experiences, etc.
Yeah, that was my first intro into human-centered design was when I was working for a national nonprofit and we had design thinkers, but I don't know what we called them there, but people doing design thinking work around program areas. And then we were creating learning to support whatever the program changes were, right? And so that allowed me to kind of get insight into their process and them to get insight into my process as a learning designer. And it was just a really interesting relationship and a really interesting way of sharing and learning from each other because there is a lot of overlap in how we do our work. But I think design thinking really gets us a level deeper in that analysis phase.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Sheryl, I am so excited that you joined me today and that you were able to share all of your key insights. I know that you probably could go on and on about both design thinking and systems thinking, but this is going to be such a great way to introduce those concepts and get people excited in both of those concepts. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so I lead a design studio called Optimistic Design, and that's just optimistic.design. You can view our work and what we're focused on at our website. And you can find me on LinkedIn as well. I'm the only Sheryl Cababa up there, so feel free to connect with me. And my book is at Rosenfeld Media, and it's called Closing the Loop Systems Thinking for Designers. So if you just search for it there, you can find it. And yeah, hopefully this has been a helpful conversation for folks and they're able to get their journey started in design thinking.
Yeah, this is great. I will drop links to those things in the show notes for everyone. Sheryl, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. This was really fun.
I know I talk a lot about understanding our audience and learning about their context and how important all of that is, but this episode really brought it home. Not only does it help us design better learning solutions, it also helps us engage our stakeholders in the decision-making process because we are approaching them with evidence. And that makes the whole process easier. So go grab Sheryl's book, check out the other resources that she mentioned, and start your design thinking journey. I'll see you next time on Learning for Good.
Hey friend, was this episode helpful for you? Did you like what you heard? Do you want more content like this? Here are 3 things you can do. Hit subscribe. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your podcast app of choice. Share this episode with a colleague. This means so much to me personally. I read every review, but it also helps me learn what content you like most so I can create more of what you want. All right, turn that Teams or Slack chat back on when you're ready, and I'll see you next time on Learning for Good.